The bass from Vantablack's subterranean floor was a physical weight, a vibration that thrummed through Niall Carter's ribs like a second, frantic heartbeat. Neon lights in electric blue and violent pink swept over the room, painting her deep brown skin in shifting, iridescent hues. She stood at the edge of the marble floor, her deep blue evening dress clinging to her curves like a second skin. To anyone watching, she looked like royalty. To Niall, she felt like a fraud. Every pulse of the music reminded her of the clock ticking back at her office. She wasn't here to dance. She was here to salvage a legacy. Behind her expressive eyes was the mental image of a stack of bankruptcy filings and the red ink of a predatory lawsuit. She was a world-class architect, a woman who built monuments of glass and steel, yet tonight she was an interloper in a brutalist paradise, searching for an investor who didn't want to be found. Niall adjusted a stray coil of her voluminous, natural hair, her posture upright and composed despite the tension coiling in her gut. The socialites around her moved with the unbothered ease of those who never checked a bank balance. They were the hunters, she was the trespasser. Seeking air, or perhaps just a moment of silence away from the suffocating scent of expensive gin, Niall slipped through a set of heavy, velvet curtains. The public floor's roar died instantly, swallowed by the thick, soundproofed walls of the restricted wing. The air here changed. It grew colder, smelling less of sweat and more of bergamot, cedar, and the sharp, metallic tang of gunmetal. Her heels clicked with solitary precision against the stone as she pushed through a heavy door marked private, expecting a balcony or a fire escape. Instead, she stumbled into a rooftop garden that shouldn't have existed this deep underground. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of a high-tech filtration system. Standing by a glass railing, framed by the jagged Seoul skyline, was Park Min-seok. He was impeccably groomed, his black suit blending into the shadows, his sharp, angular jawline set in a mask of unreadable power. As he turned, the light caught the dark, intricate dragon tattoo winding up his neck. It pulsed with the movement of his throat, a silent warning of the danger he represented. Niall didn't flinch. She let a mocking smile play on her full lips. "Is this where you come to hide from your personality?" she asked, her voice steady and sharp. Min-seok didn't blink. He crossed the space between them with the measured grace of a predator, invading her personal space until he was looking down into her alert, defiant gaze. He leaned in, his voice a low, lethal vibration against her ear. "This is where I come to decide who lives," he whispered. "And you, Niall Carter, don't belong here." "Hello, family. Welcome back to our channel. Would love to know where you are watching from. Kindly drop it in the comment section, and also if you are new here, do well to subscribe to our channel." Now let's proceed with the story. The silence in the rooftop garden was so absolute it felt heavy, a stark, vacuum-like contrast to the rhythmic violence of the club below. Niall Carter stood her ground, her deep blue gown shimmering under the moonlight like a calm ocean hiding a storm. Her heart was a frantic bird trapped in her chest, but she refused to let her breathing falter. She was an architect. She understood structure, and right now, she was studying the structure of a man who looked like he was carved from obsidian. Park Min-seok didn't move, yet his presence seemed to expand, filling the space until the very air tasted of bergamot and cold iron. He was taller than he'd appeared from across the glass, his tailored black suit fitting him with a lethal precision. Niall's gaze flickered to the ink on his neck, the dragon's tail disappearing into his collar, and she felt the primal urge to run. Instead, she tilted her chin up, letting her thick, natural coils cascade over her shoulder. "Is this where you come to hide from your personality?" she asked, her voice cutting through the stillness with a sharp, calculated edge. It was a gamble, a desperate attempt to mask the fact that she was a trespasser whose firm was currently being dismantled by lawyers back in the city. Min-seok's eyes, dark and predatory, narrowed as they swept over her. He didn't look at her like a man admiring a woman at a club. He looked at her like a strategist assessing a sudden, unexpected flaw in his perimeter. He took a single step forward, and the distance between them vanished. Niall refused to flinch, even as his shadow swallowed her whole. "You have a sharp tongue for someone standing on a ledge," he whispered, his voice a low, gravelly hum that vibrated against her skin. He leaned in closer, his face inches from hers, invading her personal space with the effortless control of someone who had never been told no. "Vantablack isn't a playground for the curious Niall Carter. It's a graveyard for those who think beauty is a shield." The mention of her name sent a cold jolt of electricity through her. She hadn't introduced herself. She was a ghost in this city, a woman who built walls but lived behind none. "You know who I am," she breathed, the mocking veneer finally showing a hairline fracture. Mincioc's gaze lingered on her full lips, then traveled back to her expressive eyes. His expression remained a mask of calm, dominant unreadability. He reached out, his hand hovering near her neck without touching it, the dark ink of his tattoo pulsing with the heavy rhythm of his pulse. "I know you are a woman who builds monuments for people who will never love her, and I know that tomorrow your legacy becomes ash," he said, his words a chillingly accurate summary of her private ruin. He leaned in even further, his breath ghosting over her ear. "You don't belong here, architectural consultant, but now that you've walked into my garden, you'll find that I don't believe in exits. I only believe in acquisitions." He pulled back, the intensity of his stare pinning her to the spot. Niall felt the weight of the moment shift. The mockery was gone, replaced by a terrifying realization. She had come here to save her firm, but she had walked directly into the lair of the only man who could either rebuild her world or burn it to the ground. As Mincioc turned back to the skyline, dismissed her with a flick of his wrist, Niall knew her life had just been rewritten in his ink. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Carter and Associates, but it offered no warmth to the sterile, quiet office. Niall sat at her mahogany desk, her fingers tracing the jagged edge of a final foreclosure notice. The Architect of the Year plaque on the wall felt like a tombstone. She had spent the night scrubbed clean of the blue silk and the scent of Vantablack, but the low, lethal vibration of Park Mincioc's voice still echoed in her marrow. The glass doors of the lobby didn't just open, they seemed to surrender. Niall looked up as the air in the room suddenly pressurized. Mincioc walked in with the silent, heavy grace of an apex predator entering a familiar territory. He was no longer the shadow in a garden. He was a shark in a suit of charcoal wool, his presence making the expansive office feel claustrophobically small. Behind him, two men in sharp black suits stood like monoliths, sealing the exit. "You're late for your own funeral, Mr. Park," Niall said, her voice holding onto a shred of her trademark defiance even as her pulse spiked. She stood slowly, smoothing her tailored cream slacks, her natural hair piled high in a crown that added to her height. Mincioc didn't answer. He navigated the room with a proprietary gaze, his eyes lingering on the blueprints scattered across the tables, monuments to a legacy that was currently bleeding out. He stopped at her desk and leaned forward, his hands flat on the wood. The dragon tattoo on his neck peeked out from his collar, its dark ink a stark contrast to his smooth, bronzed skin. "Your designs are ambitious, Niall. They speak of a woman who wants to build a world she can control," he murmured, his intense, calculating eyes locking onto hers. "But you forgot that the land beneath your structures belongs to me." He pulled a leather-bound checkbook from his inner pocket, the movement slow and deliberate. Niall watched, breathless, as he took a fountain pen and scribbled a figure that made the predatory lawsuit against her look like a rounding error. It was more than a bailout. It was a total acquisition. "This check clears your debt. It buys your firm, your staff, and every hour of your time for the next 6 months," he said, his voice dropping to that low, dangerous rumble she remembered from the garden. He tore the slip of paper away and slid it across the desk toward her. It stopped against her trembling fingertips. "I don't need a savior," Niall hissed, though the weight of the paper felt like a lifeline made of lead. "I'm not a savior," Mincioc corrected, his expression calm and unreadable as he leaned in, invading her space until she could smell the bergamot on his skin. "I'm the man who just bought the Architect of the Year. You wanted to save your family's legacy? You just did. But the price is your autonomy. You don't work for the city anymore. You work for the dragon." He straightened up, his calculative gaze sweeping over her one last time. "My car will be here at dawn tomorrow. Pack your blueprints. We're going to the mountains." Without waiting for her consent, he turned and walked out, leaving Niall standing in a room that was no longer hers, holding a check that felt like a beautiful, golden shackle. The hostile takeover was complete. The intellectual architect had been outmaneuvered by a man who didn't play by the rules of glass and steel. The ascent into the Buckhanson Peaks was a journey into a world where nature had been colonized by the cold precision of technology. The black sedan wound through the mist-shrouded roads with a silent, heavy purpose, leaving the sprawling neon grid of Seoul behind. Niall sat in the backseat, her gaze fixed on the passing jagged rock faces, her sketchbook clutched in her lap like a shield. Beside her, Min Seok was a statue of tailored charcoal wool, his attention seemingly focused on a tablet, though his presence felt like a physical weight pressing against her ribs. When the fortress finally emerged through the fog, it didn't look like a home, it looked like a dare. Built of black slate, reinforced glass, and brutalist concrete, the structure was carved directly into the mountain's spine. It was a masterpiece of architectural arrogance, overlooking the world with 1,000 electronic eyes. "This is the dragon's lair," Min Seok murmured as the iron gates groaned open, his voice a low vibration that seemed to match the hum of the car's engine. Or at least, the skeleton of it. They stepped out into the biting mountain air. Niall's deep blue coat fluttered in the wind, but her eyes were already scanning the perimeter with the professional detachment she used to survive. She noted the thermal sensors, the reinforced support beams, and the way the glass was angled to prevent long-range surveillance. It was impressive, but to her trained eye, it was incomplete. Min Seok led her through the massive obsidian doors into a great hall that felt more like a cathedral dedicated to control. The interior was a labyrinth of sharp angles and shadow, with light provided only by recessed LED strips that pulsed like a digital heartbeat. He stopped at a massive slate table where a holographic projector flickered to life, bathing the room in a ghostly blue glow. A three-dimensional map of the estate hovered between them. "Your previous clients wanted beauty, Niall. They wanted monuments to their vanity," Min Seok said, stepping into her space until the scent of bergamot and cold rain enveloped her. He gestured to the glowing blue lines of the fortress. "I don't care about beauty. I care about survival. My rivals believe there is no place on Earth I can hide. I want you to prove them wrong." Niall looked at the blueprint, her mind already racing with structural flaws and blind spots. "You want me to build you a cage," she whispered, her expressive eyes meeting his calculating gaze. "I want you to make it unbreakable," he corrected, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate rumble. He reached out, his hand hovering just inches from her shoulder, the dragon tattoo on his neck pulsing with a life of its own in the blue light. "You are the architect of the year. Redesign the security protocols. Map every hidden tunnel, every reinforced wall. If a single breath enters this house without my permission, it is your failure." Niall felt the weight of the golden shackles tightening. She was no longer just a consultant. She was the architect of a king's sanctuary. She looked from the holographic map to the man who now owned her firm, her home, and her time. The mountain was silent, but as she picked up the digital stylus, she realized she wasn't just building a fortress for Min Seok. She was building the very walls that would keep her trapped at his side. The following week, the fortress transitioned from a construction site to a nerve center. The air in the mountain estate was no longer filled with the sound of drills, but with a heavy, pressurized silence that Niall found far more taxing. Min Seok had summoned his inner circle, the men who managed the jagged edges of his empire, and for the first time, Niall was forced to step out from behind her blueprints and into the light of his dangerous reality. She stood at Min Seok's side in the formal dining hall, her deep brown skin glowing against the cream silk of her blouse. The table was a sea of dark suits and impassive faces, a gathering of men who looked at her not as a world-class architect, but as a curiosity, a temporary fixture in their master's life. Niall felt their gazes like needles against her skin, but she kept her posture upright, her natural curls framed by the sharp geometry of the room. Min Seok didn't introduce her. He didn't have to. His hand rested possessively on the back of her chair, his tattooed fingers a constant, silent mark of ownership. Throughout the dinner, he didn't speak to his men of business. He spoke of architecture, of the unbreakable nature of the home she was building. But as the wine flowed, his voice dropped, intended only for her ear. "Watch their eyes, Niall," he whispered, leaning in until the scent of bergamot and expensive tobacco enveloped her. "In my world, words are the decoys. Silence is the primary language." He nodded toward a man at the far end of the table whose smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "That is Han. He speaks the loudest of his loyalty, but see how his thumbs twitch against the silver. He is calculating the cost of a betrayal. And there, beside him, Lee. He hasn't looked at me once. He is waiting for a sign of weakness." Niall watched, her analytical mind shifting from structural load-bearing to human psychology. She saw the subtle tilts of heads, the way some men leaned toward Minseok while others pulled back into the shadows. It was a blueprint of a different kind, a map of power and instability. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice a low murmur that barely carried over the clink of crystal. Minseok's gaze shifted from the table to her, his eyes intense and unreadable. He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a slow, deliberate pressure that made her breath hitch. The dragon on his neck seemed to pulse in the low light, mirroring the jagged rhythm of her own heart. "Because you are the architect of my sanctuary," he said, his voice a dark, intimate rumble. "But a house is only as strong as the people within it. If you cannot read the rot in the room, you will never build a wall thick enough to keep us safe." The realization hit her then. He wasn't just teaching her to protect the house. He was teaching her how to survive him and the world he had chained her to. As the dinner ended, and the men stood in a synchronized show of obedience, Niall realized the intellectual arrogance she had carried into the Vantablack garden was useless here. In the language of silence, she was still a beginner, and Minseok was the only one who could teach her the vocabulary of survival. The architectural integrity of the mountain stronghold was Niall's obsession, a puzzle of steel and slate that she mapped meticulously by day and dreamed of by night. It was during a late-night audit of the ventilation shafts, a discrepancy in the air pressure readings, that she found it. A section of the western corridor was 4 feet narrower on the blueprints than it was in reality. Niall pressed her palm against the seamless obsidian paneling, her fingers searching for the tactile signature of a hidden latch. Her deep brown skin stood in stark contrast to the cold stone, her breath hitching as a hairline fracture appeared in the wall. The panel hissed open, revealing a space that shouldn't have existed according to the schematics she had been given. The room was a clinical masterpiece of surveillance technology. A wall of monitors glowed in a soft, electric violet, casting long shadows across the floor. Niall stepped inside, the air smelling of ozone and the bergamot scent that always heralded Minseok's presence. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized what the screens were displaying. They weren't monitoring the perimeter. They were monitoring her. One screen showed her hunched over her drafting table in the library. Another caught her in the kitchen at 3:00 a.m. A third showed her right now, entering this very room from a high-angle perspective. The fortress wasn't just a shield against his enemies. It was a lens focused entirely on her life. Every sigh, every moment of frustration, and every defiant look she had aimed at the empty air had been recorded and catalogued. The structural load of this wing was always designed to support more than just secrets, Niall. The voice was a low, lethal vibration that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. Niall spun around to find Minseok leaning against the doorframe, his dark suit blending into the darkness, his expression a mask of dominant calm. The dragon tattoo on his neck pulsed slowly, a rhythmic reminder of the predator who had trapped her. "You've been watching me," she breathed, her voice trembling with a mixture of fury and a terrifying sense of exposure. "Every room, every hour. You didn't hire an architect, you hired a specimen for your cage." Minseok crossed the room with the measured grace of a man who owned everything his eyes touched. He stopped inches from her, invading her space until she was pinned between the glowing monitors and his heat. He reached out, his hand hovering near her jaw, his eyes intense and unreadable. "I told you I don't believe in exits, Niall. I only believe in acquisitions," he whispered, his voice dropping to a dark, intimate rumble. "To protect an asset, one must understand its every movement, its every weakness." "I am not an asset," she hissed, her expressive eyes flashing with defiance. "You are the most valuable thing in this mountain," Minseok corrected, his thumb finally grazing her skin with a possessive pressure. "And in my world, what is valuable is never left to chance." As he leaned in, his scent overwhelming her senses, Niall realized the first breach wasn't a failure of her architecture. It was the moment she understood that the walls she was building weren't there to keep the world out. They were designed to keep her exactly where he could see her. The intellectual arrogance she had used as a shield was gone, replaced by the chilling reality that in the dragon's lair, there was no such thing as privacy, only the illusion of it. The gala at the Blue House had been a theater of war, a night of gilded knives and sharp smiles where Niall had functioned as Minseok's most radiant armor. Dressed in a gown of molten gold that complemented her glowing skin, She had moved through the crowd of diplomats and oligarchs not as an employee, but as an enigma. She had watched the language of silence play out in real time, catching the tremor in a rival's hand and the predatory stillness in Minsiok's gaze. For the first time, she hadn't just been a witness to his power. She had been the architect of it, her presence signaling a new, untouchable stability in his empire. The drive back to the mountain fortress was consumed by a heavy, electric tension. The city lights fell away, replaced by the jagged, moonlit silhouettes of the Buckhanson peaks. Inside the car, the silence was no longer cold. It was thick with a mutual recognition that the 6-month term of their contract had become an irrelevant formality. When they reached the Great Hall, the heavy obsidian doors hissed shut, sealing out the world. The adrenaline of the evening was still coursing through Niall's veins, a cocktail of triumph and terror. She turned to find Minsiok already watching her, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar to reveal the full, menacing length of the dragon tattoo. "You were perfect tonight," he murmured, his voice a low, lethal vibration that seemed to pull the oxygen from the room. "I was doing my job," Niall replied, though her voice lacked its usual bite. She stood by the massive slate table, her hand resting near the holographic blueprints she had spent months perfecting. "The contract states I am to provide aesthetic and strategic support. I simply—" Minsiok moved with a speed that defied his calm exterior, closing the distance between them until her back was pressed against the cold edge of the table. He didn't touch her, but his heat was a physical barrier. "The contract is paper, Niall. What happened tonight was blood." He leaned in, his scent of bergamot and wood smoke overwhelming her senses, his eyes dark with a hunger that wasn't for power. "You didn't protect me because of a debt. You did it because you've realized that my world is the only one big enough for you." Niall looked up at him, her expressive eyes searching his for a lie she couldn't find. The intellectual arrogance she had used as a shield for so long finally crumbled. She realized then that she wasn't a prisoner in this mountain. She was the only person who truly understood the monster who ruled it. The unspoken contract wasn't about architectural consultation or debt repayment. It was a mutual surrender. "I don't belong here," she whispered, echoing his words from their first meeting. "No," Minsiok agreed, his hand finally coming up to cup her jaw, his thumb tracing the fullness of her lower lip with a feral tenderness. "You don't belong here as a guest. You belong here as the heartbeat of this house." When he kissed her, it wasn't a question. It was a hostile takeover of her soul. Niall didn't fight him. She pulled him closer, her fingers tangling in his hair, realizing that the walls she had built to keep the world out had finally become the sanctuary she never knew she needed. The golden shackles hadn't broken. They had simply transformed into something stronger. As the physical wall between them shattered, Niall knew the exit strategy she had dreamed of was gone. Replaced by a dark, permanent kingdom, she was no longer afraid to rule. The aftermath of their surrender brought no peace, only a sharpened sense of the knives being honed in the dark. The mountain air grew colder as winter's first breath clawed at the black slate of the fortress, and within the halls, the atmosphere shifted from the heat of passion to the clinical chill of preparation. Minsiok did not bring Niall flowers or jewelry to mark their new reality. Instead, he brought her a set of classified structural requirements and a fresh roll of vellum. He led her to a secluded corner of the master wing, behind a reinforced mahogany bookshelf that she had designed to be purely decorative. With a coded sequence, the shelf slid back to reveal a hollow core of raw, industrial concrete. It was a scar in the middle of her masterpiece. "The aesthetic of this house is yours, Niall," Minsiok said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that resonated in the small space. He stood behind her, his heat a familiar weight, but his eyes were fixed on the empty void. "But the survival of its heart is mine. I need you to design a sanctuary within the sanctuary, a place where you can exist when the rest of the world is burning." Niall looked at the cold concrete, the reality of his life finally stripping away the last of her architectural fantasies. She was being asked to design a panic room, not for a client's theoretical peace of mind, but for her own physical survival. The aesthetic of war was a brutal one. It required lead-lined walls, independent oxygen scrubbers, and a communications array that could pierce through any jammer. "You're expecting an attack," she whispered, her fingers tracing the rough gray stone. "I am expecting my rivals to realize that I finally have a pulse," Minsiok replied, leaning in until his lips brushed the shell of her ear. The dragon on his neck seemed to writhe in the dim light. "They couldn't hurt me when I had nothing. Now I have you. That makes this room the most important structure you will ever build." As she began to sketch, Niall realized that every line she drew was a testament to the danger she had accepted. She wasn't just choosing a color palette or a furniture layout. She was calculating the blast radius of plastic explosives and the thickness of ballistic glass. She was designing a tomb that doubled as a womb, a place to hide when the monsters Minciok kept at bay finally broke through the obsidian doors. The intellectual arrogance that had once defined her felt like a relic from another life. She understood now that beauty in Minciok's world was merely a thin veneer over a foundation of violence. As she mapped out the hidden entrance and the emergency egress tunnels, she felt a strange, dark pride. She was no longer just building a house. She was fortifying a kingdom. Minciok watched her work, his presence a silent, dominant anchor. When she finally looked up, her alert gaze met his calculating one. "It will be unbreakable," she promised. "It has to be," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her throat with a possessive intensity. "Because if these walls fail, the world ends." In that moment, surrounded by blueprints of steel and lead, Niall didn't feel like a prisoner or a consultant. She felt like a general. She had moved past the fear of his world and had begun to master its architecture, realizing that in the dragon's lair, the only way to stay safe was to become the most dangerous thing in the room. The legal vultures didn't wait for the winter thaw to strike. While Niall was buried in the schematics of her survival, a digital courier bypassed the mountain's firewalls, not with a virus, but with a summons. Her former partners at the firm, the men she had trusted to anchor her legacy, had filed an injunction. They weren't just contesting Minciok's acquisition. They were alleging that Niall had embezzled company funds to pay for her mother's care, offering her up as a sacrificial lamb to the city's prosecutors in exchange for their own immunity. Niall stood in the center of the library, the tablet in her hand trembling. The intellectual arrogance that had once been her armor felt like a shroud. She had built skyscrapers, but she had failed to see the rot in her own foundation. "They're selling me out," she whispered, her voice echoing hollowly against the obsidian shelves. "They're using the very firm I saved to bury me." The heavy click of Minciok's heels against the slate floor signaled his arrival. He didn't offer comfort, he offered gravity. He walked to the window, looking out at the jagged peaks of Buckhanson, his black suit a sharp silhouette against the gray mist. The dragon on his neck seemed to darken, its tail winding tighter around his throat as his jaw set in a mask of lethal calm. "In your world, disloyalty is handled with paperwork and litigation," Minciok said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that made the air in the room feel thin. "In mine, it is handled with finality." He turned, his intense, calculating eyes locking onto hers. He didn't look like the man who had held her in the molten gold of the gala. He looked like the dragon who had built a throne on the bones of his enemies. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of her head, forcing her to look up at him. "They think they can play with what is mine," he hissed, his breath ghosting over her lips. "They think a board meeting is a shield against a monster." Within the hour, the language of silence Niall had been learning became a deafening reality. Minciok didn't call a lawyer. He called a private meeting in the subterranean levels of the fortress. When the monitors flickered to life, Niall saw her former partners, the men who had toasted her success just months ago, sitting in a windowless room, their easy confidence replaced by a primal, sweating terror. Minciok leaned over the console, his presence invading the screen's digital space just as he had invaded Niall's. He didn't scream. He spoke with the terrifying precision of a surgeon. He detailed their offshore accounts, their private indiscretions, and the exact cost of their lives. Niall watched, her soft yet powerful features set in a mask of realization. She saw how he dismantled their greed, stripping them of their leverage until they were begging to sign a full confession of their own fraud. "You don't belong in a courtroom, Niall," Minciok murmured, turning to her as the screens went black. He traced the line of her jaw, his thumb lingering over her skin with a possessive heat. "You belong here, at my side, where no one can touch you without losing their hands." She looked at him, seeing the monster and the man in equal measure. The betrayal of her peers had severed her last tie to the world she once knew. She wasn't just an architect anymore. She was an accomplice to a power that defied the law. As the sun set behind the peaks, Niall realized that Minseok hadn't just saved her firm. He had burned the bridge back to her old life, ensuring that the only sanctuary she had left was the one she had built for him. The silence of the mountain was shattered not by a sound, but by the sudden, violent death of the electronics. The soft violet glow of the library monitors flickered and died, plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness that smelled of ozone and impending rain. Niall froze, her hand still gripping a charcoal pencil. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that preceded a landslide. Then, the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of high-altitude rotor blades began to beat against the reinforced glass of the Great Hall. The attack was surgical. Explosions rocked the western perimeter, the vibrations traveling through the slate floors and into Niall's very marrow. She scrambled toward the hidden door of her sanctuary, her heart a frantic hammer against her ribs. In the strobe-like flashes of emergency red lighting, she saw the aesthetic of war she had designed finally being put to the test. Niall, the tunnel now. Minseok appeared through the smoke, his charcoal suit jacket gone, his white shirt stained with oil and something darker. He looked less like a man and more like the dragon of legend, feral, lethal, and desperate. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her skin with a possessive urgency, and shoved her toward the hidden egress she had mapped out just weeks prior. The tunnel leads to the northern ridge. My men are waiting there. Go! He hissed, his voice a raw, jagged edge. He handed her a sleek, matte black handgun, the weight of it cold and foreign in her palm. Niall looked at the open hatch of the escape route, the exit she had dreamed of since the night at Vantablack. Beyond it lay the path back to a world where architecture was just glass and steel, where her name could be her own again. But as another blast shook the foundation, she looked back at Minseok. He was reloading a weapon, his gaze already turning toward the breached doors, his neck tattoo pulsing with the frantic rhythm of a man prepared to die to hold the line. The choice crystallized in the smoke-filled air. If she left, she was the invisible consultant of the world again, a victim of circumstance fleeing into the night. If she stayed, she was the architect of the new order, the woman who knew the structural weaknesses of the men coming through the door better than they did. I didn't build this fortress to watch it fall, Minseok, she said, her voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm vibration. She didn't move toward the tunnel. Instead, she stepped back into the pressurized heat of the room, her expressive eyes locking onto his. Minseok's breath hitched, a flicker of something that looked like awe breaking through his predatory mask. He saw it then. The intellectual arrogance had transformed into a warrior's resolve. Niall reached for the control console, bypassing the jammed locks with a sequence only the designer could know. She didn't just seal the internal doors, she trapped the invaders in the very corridors she had built. You don't belong here, Niall, he whispered, even as he moved to cover her, his body a shield of heat and lead. I belong wherever I choose to stand, she countered, her finger hovering over the final defensive trigger. And tonight, I choose the dragon. The fortress groaned as the primary breach was contained. Niall stood in the center of her creation, the architect who had finally stopped building walls and started defending them. The girl who had mocked a monster was gone. In her place stood a queen who knew that freedom wasn't about the exit, it was about who you stood beside when the world burned. The heavy, iron-scented smoke of the attack had long since been swept away by the mountain winds, replaced by the crisp, biting air of a new season. The fortress on the Buckhanson Peaks no longer felt like a structure under siege. It felt like a monument to a transition. The black slate and reinforced glass remained, but the aesthetic of war had evolved. It was no longer a cage designed to hold Niall Carter, but a palace designed to protect her. Inside the Great Hall, the massive slate table was no longer covered in blueprints or surveillance feeds. Instead, it was set for a meeting of the syndicate's highest tier, the men who had once looked at Niall as a temporary distraction. Today, the atmosphere in the room was different. The language of silence was loud with a new kind of respect, a heavy, pressurized deference that was directed not just toward the man at the head of the table, but toward the woman standing beside him. Niall stood at the head of the board, her deep brown skin glowing against a gown of charcoal silk that matched the sharp, unyielding lines of the room. Her natural curls were pinned back, revealing a gaze that was no longer just alert, but commanding. She had spent months building the walls of this kingdom, and in doing so, she had built a new version of herself. The intellectual arrogance was gone, replaced by the lethal clarity of a woman who had looked into the abyss and decided to decorate it. Minseok sat to her right, his posture relaxed but his eyes never leaving her. The dragon tattoo on his neck was partially obscured by his collar, but its presence felt more integrated into the room than ever. He wasn't the master of the house today, he was the partner in a dual monarchy. When he spoke, his voice was a low, proud rumble. The new protocols are in place. The mountain is secure, not because of the steel, but because of the mind that placed it. Niall looked down the length of the table, her full lips curving into a smile that held no mockery, only the cold, certain power of a ruler. She remembered the girl in the blue silk who had stumbled into a restricted garden to save a failing firm. That girl was dead, buried under the weight of the mountain. In her place was the woman who had realized that freedom wasn't about an exit tunnel or a cleared debt. It was about the audacity to stand where you weren't supposed to belong and stay until the world accepted your presence. "Gentlemen," Niall said, her voice a smooth, authoritative vibration that commanded the room's absolute silence. "The architecture of this empire is changing. We are no longer just surviving the shadows. We are going to own them." Minseok reached out, his hand covering hers on the table. The physical touch was no longer an act of possession, but a public oath. As the men bowed their heads in a synchronized show of loyalty, Niall felt the last of the golden shackles dissolve. She wasn't a consultant, a prisoner, or an acquisition. She was the architect of the new kingdom, the woman who had designed a throne for two, and she was finally home. The dragon had found his match, and together they had built something unbreakable.